Swanee, you want to clip that on? Okay. Okay.
So we can sit together. Come on. Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Swanee Hunt, and I direct the Women in Public Policy program here at the Kennedy School. And I also have the great joy of chairing an initiative called Women Waging Peace, which every year has a colloquium here at the Kennedy School. This year, we have about 35 women from over 20 conflict areas who are here for a week. They're exchanging their strategies with each other from very, very different situations and finding all kinds of commonalities in the problems that they're facing and the approaches that could be useful. But they're also honing their message so that they will be speaking to about 140 policymakers tomorrow who are coming in from the U.S. government, from the United Nations, capitals around the world, international communities, NGOs, etc., to learn from these experts. This evening, we have gathered 3 women who are doing their peace-building work in situations that are marked with terrorist activities. And we thought that since the whole theme of terrorism is one that is painfully on the minds of Americans in a way that it wasn't a year and a half before, we would hear from women this evening for whom the word about September 11th was reminiscent. It was an echo for them of life that they have known. It was interesting because when the World Trade Towers were hit, there was all of this business about how life is now changed. The world is suddenly different. Well, the world wasn't suddenly different for people who've been living in these terrorist situations for years and decades even. And so this is a reminder this evening that in these situations, women have been not only victims and traumatized, but they have been responding by coming up with all kinds of initiatives to try to stabilize those situations. We're going to begin with a dear friend of mine, Monica McWilliams, who is a founding member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and a member of the Northern Irish Assembly. Can we still say that now that it's imploded? Okay. It's only a temporary implosion. She was instrumental in the multi-party negotiations that led to the signing of the historic Good Friday Agreement in '98. She is also a professor of women's studies and social policy, and Dr. McWilliams has written and published extensively on the impact of political conflict and domestic violence on women in Northern Ireland. As a signatory of the Good Friday Agreement, she was awarded the National Democratic Institute Award and the John F. Kennedy Leadership and Courage Award. She is also the recipient of the Frank Cousins Peace Award and Boston Immigration Center's Women of the Year Award. Monica McWilliams, take a few minutes. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be here, Swanee, and it's good to see some very familiar faces who have visited Northern Ireland over the years. For me, an essential precondition for any peace process is when all sides recognise that no further political gains can be made by violence. I think that's a very important precondition to a peace process. I think it's also important that when the state recognises that military victory over its enemies is unlikely, and at the same time the insurgents recognise that violence has reached the limit of its effectiveness. And that, I believe, is what happened in Northern Ireland. No one in Northern Ireland is still able to say that the war is over, but most of us believe that. And hence the reason why this government and assembly that I was involved in collapsed the week before last. because we still haven't got this recognition that we have truly moved from the end of a war into a fully fledged peace process. But actually, peace is a process, not an event. And too often when you reach an agreement, people think that it's an event. And the implementation of a peace agreement is actually more difficult than the authorship or the ownership or the writing of that agreement itself, and I have discovered that. So if no one has won the war, and in our country it was a draw. It was a draw between the British Army and the Irish Republican Army. And since no one won it, everyone then had to become involved in winning the peace. The other ingredient that I think helped our process was the international involvement of people from outside the country. But that sometimes becomes a problem in itself. In fact, Phil here has been involved for many years in the Northern Ireland peace process, and many people here from Boston itself and the foundations that have been involved in the Kennedy School have come to Northern Ireland. And it's a very important ingredient to a peace process to make comparisons about what works and what doesn't work in other countries. And in fact, our peace process borrowed a great deal from the South African process. And indeed today, listening here, I learned about the Guatemala process. And the night before the Good Friday Agreement at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I opened up the website of Guatemala to see what they had done over the issue of decommissioning of weapons. And today I was talking to one of the negotiators here in Women Waging Peace. And what they did in their decommissioning of their weapons was they had an ingredient that we didn't have, which was trust. When they handed over their weapons, there was a belief that that was the weapons and all of the weapons. When the IRA handed over their weapons after our agreement, there was no belief that that was all of their weapons. And so there still was a belief that they remained so-called terrorists. I actually think you also need to unpick this word terrorist. Is it a bunch of criminals that went to the peace table? Or was there some cause that led to the war in the first place? Was it ideological? Was there social and political and economic causes? And when a war is over, you actually then have the political recognition that the causes of the war are also over. And perhaps that's why we still have some terrifying consequences in Northern Ireland at the minute, in that some of the rejectionists of our agreement still don't believe that the causes of that war were over. There is also another important ingredient, which is that you need to give your enemies some legitimacy. If you don't legitimize the enemies and you don't include them at the peace table, then perhaps you will never arrive at a peace agreement. So the process for us had to be inclusive and it had to be legitimate. And so for me, there's no point in going on talking about not talking to terrorists, because all you do is create more terrorists, because both sides recognize the other as terrorists. And it depends on who decides on what forms terror. And actually in Northern Ireland, most of the women who had experienced political violence and domestic violence could have described that terror in very different ways. So the people who get to decide what constitutes terror can often be very powerful people. The most important thing about our negotiations is that everybody had to give something, and everybody then owned a piece of the agreement. That's okay in negotiations. You can have perhaps bargains and compromises. But for an agreement to truly work, you have to have what I would call a transcendence. People really have to change. All of us have to change. And you have to change your institutions. You have to change the concepts of how you build support. Civic society has to change. The political parties have to change. And you personally have to change. The four things that I think are important after an agreement and to remove terrorism is you have to have governance and stability. You have to have law and order. You have to have social and economic progress. And you have to have reconciliation. Perhaps the last, and how you deal with your grievances and your grief and your victims, is the most difficult. And we say you need to remember, but you need to change. And the concepts of remember and change can often make the difference between still having terror and not having terror. And that perhaps is what we haven't worked on hard enough. the qualitative nature of changing your society and changing your attitudes. So we've changed how we thought about citizenship, we've changed how we've thought about political identity, nationality, the nature of our government, how we vote, how we go to elections. And so we're trying to become a normalised society, whatever that means. I think when you have been accustomed to violence like I have for 30 years, and I'm now bringing up small children in this country, and I watch them and I watch 8-year-olds dividing up bricks in the street to be able to throw at other 8-year-olds who they don't even know across the peace wall, and how they demonise the stranger and the other because they haven't become reconciled to true peace. But it's a different kind of peace. And it's not the terror that I stood at gravesides and dived from bombs and tried to avoid assassinations. I think the country is now much more peaceful, and it's probably much more normalised. What we have to do also is reintegrate your prisoners, reintegrate your combatants. And in Guatemala today I learned that they hadn't put enough resources into the process of reintegration. And so you can build up a lot of resentment and a lot of difficulties if you don't actually put a lot of attention into that word reintegration. And for me it's a very powerful word. The decommissioning of weapons has become the most important, according to some players, the most important ingredient in determining whether we've moved from war to peace. To me, reintegration is the most important ingredient in how we will move from war to peace. And so I will finish by simply saying that human rights and equality and social inclusion are 3 very important factors in a new peace process. Yeats once said, "Out of Ireland we have come. Great hatred, little room has maimed us from the start." We created a little room. That little room was where we went to the peace table, where we negotiated a peace agreement. And now we have to create much room to keep that dialogue going. What women understand in all of this is get people to the table, ask the question who is not at the table, and keep them at the table, and keep talking. Because the power of dialogue is really about the power to change, and only then will you have truly challenged terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Marta Segura, committed to a sustainable peace in Colombia. Marta is Executive Director of the ODIHR, it's in Spanish, Confederación Colombiana de ONG.
ONGs.
ON what?
ONGs.
ONGs. NGOs. A network of I think it's 1,200, over 1,200 NGOs throughout the country. Created in '89 as a UN project, the Confederación is one of several organizations working to end the long-standing conflict by coordinating the peace-building efforts of the government, private sector, international agencies, and NGOs. Ms. Segura has represented the NGO community in negotiations and was instrumental in the adoption of the Programmatic Agreement for Peace, signed by members of the Confederation, international agencies, and the government. Marta.
Thank you, Swani. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. The highest rate of homicides that we had in the world last year was in Colombia. 34,000 Colombians died every year because of violence. 18,000 people are being kidnapped lately. And from this, today, when we are here, more than 3,000 Colombians are still being held by the guerrillas. A few months ago, in the Chocó department, the Chocó state is a very poor state, northern Colombia, 170 people, mostly women and children, died in a church. And every one of us, every Colombian has, or in his family or friends, somebody that has been kidnapped or killed. As a matter of fact, I have 4 of my schoolmates were kidnapped, and my husband's cousin was kidnapped and killed. And we know that these 40 years of war are because of poverty, exclusion, inequity, and also by drugs, because of drugs. Because, you know, in Central America, as you know, Nicaragua, Salvador, Guatemala, the guerrilla didn't deal with drugs, and it was easier to finish the war. But now, the guerrilla in Colombia is receiving $1 million a day, and the paramilitaries, because they deal with drugs. And this is really a different matter in the war in Colombia. So I think that all of us, especially the international community, has also to think about it, how drugs make the difference. In Colombia, the guerrilla has the position that they are defending the poor people, and they have to fight for the rights of the poor people. And the paramilitaries think they are defending the people in the rural areas, the landlords, and they are defending property, and they are defending security. And the government, the last government, think we cannot deal in a negotiation table anymore after 4 years that our last President Pastrana spent negotiating with the guerrilla. And what about civil society? What do we do? What do we care? What are we questioning us? The Confederación Colombiana de ONGs is part of the civil society, and we think we have a role to play in all this peace negotiation and peace process. Because as many women said during these days, peace can take more than 40 years. So, but we have to be aware of our role. So we have to put at the table some hypotheses for our members and other members of civil society in Colombia. And we said one of our hypotheses is we don't have a vision, a unified vision of the conflict. And we have 3 armies, the paramilitary army, the guerrilla army, and the army for the democratic state, which is the República of Colombia. Are we aware of which army is our army? Or every one of these armies are the same? As we ask many people in Colombia, do you think all the armies are the same, or we have to support one of them? Mm-hmm. And about terrorism, you know, terrorism is worst because the paramilitaries and the guerrilla, they want that civil society put itself in one or another position. So by terrorism, this is exactly the way that Pablo Escobar did it years ago. But using terrorism, society is so terrified that start adopting positions without reflection and without discussing. We also believe that civil society in an internal conflict always has to decide what is going to do, what is going to happen with the conflict finally, and which is the army that they're going to support. As in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas, the Nicaraguan people said the Sandinista army is the army that we are going to support, and we believe that, and they are defending our rights. So we have to have a choice also in Colombia. And that also put us in this discussion about democratic security. Democratic security is one of the late policies of our president. But we think that democratic security, that means security of food, of housing, of mobilization, of human rights. Because if we don't have human rights, democratic security is not possible in any place in the world. So we are working with civil society since 1 year ago for this peace agreement. And I don't know if you understand, but in this kind of society where we have 62 political movements, 62, can you imagine? I mean, everybody wants his own movement and his own idea and his own look for solution. And in this fragmented society, to agree with somebody is really, really hard. So we look for agreement, and then we decide to put these conversations once a month with people from the society, and forums, and debates, and a lot of places to dialogue, to have dialogue with the people. And we decide to write the agreement with 4 goals. One of these goals is we believe in the social state ruled by law, and we are going to work for that. And that means we believe in our constitution, we believe in democracy, and we believe in our army. And the second goal is we are going to work for the human rights in all our projects, in all our plans, in all what we do, in all the places of Colombia that are NGOs and social society organizations. We are going to promote and defend the human rights. The third goal is we have to build coalitions, partnerships, and alliances with others, with the church, because we have a Catholic church, and it's mostly of the people are Catholic, with the government, because without the government, we cannot build another country, build democracy. So we need to do partnerships. We need to do partnerships with Women Waging Peace, with Harvard. That's why I'm here, because I believe that we have to create these partnerships. And the last goal is we all of us have to build collective goods for the community in all our projects. And with this agreement, a year ago, all our institution members are working in strategic plans with the mayors in the city, with the governors, to do it real, because we don't need an agreement in the paper. We need an agreement in the society, with the communities. And this is going to bring us governability and legitimacy of our government, our state. So this is how we build peace. And I think we will never have the peace by a military solution, never. So we believe doing this and working and being here with you is how we build peace.
Thank you, Marta. Now, working for an end to the 20-year conflict that has devastated Sri Lanka's economy, Neela Marikar is a spokesperson for Sri Lanka First. This powerful group of leaders from the country's business community advocates for peace and regional stability through a negotiated settlement between the government of Sri Lanka and the separatist Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. A prominent member of Sri Lanka's influential business community, Ms. Marikar is also managing director of Grant McCann Erickson, a member of the international network McCann Erickson Worldwide USA, and has more than 20 years' experience in advertising, promotions, and public relations. Take it, Neela.
Thank you, Swani. Well, I'm a business leader, as Swani said, and I came into the peace process not as a woman. I came into the peace process as the country was in crisis, and I had something to contribute. On the 24th of July last year, the country faced a devastating economic crisis. We had a terrorist attack on our airport, and within one sweep, we lost 500 national airline and 2/3 of our Air Force, because they both shared the common runway. The fallout of this was devastating economically for us. Firstly, we got very bad international press, which resulted in Sri Lanka being branded as a high-risk destination. This meant that tourism virtually dried up overnight, because every aircraft that landed thereafter was being charged a premium of $150,000. Every passenger who got off that aircraft was going to be charged $80. And because they foresaw that possibly the next attack would be on the port, every ship that was going to call was going to be charged a premium of $100,000. Now you can imagine what that did to the country, because the three key economic contributors is tourism, is our garment exports, and tea. Now, all three sectors were so badly hit that the consequences were frightening. And as the business community, who had up to that point not got involved collectively in resolving the 20-year conflict, I think it was a wake-up call to all of us. And it was at that point that we realized if we didn't resolve it, if we had one more attack like this, I think we would have had to close shop, we would have had to close down our businesses, we would have had millions of people without jobs. So the consequences were very, very powerful. Well, in the face of this, I was working as a volunteer to the Ministry of Tourism, and I was fortunate because working in marketing communications, I was able to get together a group of business leaders, all of us who were affected from the three sectors that I mentioned, to come together to form some kind of business coalition to look at what we could do as a business community in the face of this crisis that the country was dealing with. The sectors that I mentioned were the leaders that we got together, and we decided the first step we had to do was not get into looking at how we can improve the airport security or the port security, because these were all superficial things. These were all patchwork as far as we saw it. The more we went into it, the more we realized we had to get to the root of the cause, which is we had to end the war. I think the attack on the airport also had quite an impact on civil society, because I think by that time people were tired of the war, 20 years of the war, and this war had demonstrated for quite a while now that it was not a winnable war. Neither side had gained anything militarily. So I think civil society was ready to take this whole process forward. And what we were able to do as a business community is that our mandate was to put pressure on our political parties, especially in the South, where there is great acrimony between the political parties, to put aside their party agendas and come together for the sake of the country. But we all know that political leaders don't listen to small business communities, but they do listen to voters. So our strategy was to bring civil society on board and talk to our political leaders through civil society. In order to do that, we believed we had to actually educate civil society on what this war had actually cost the country for the last 20 years, what it had done to our economy, what it had done to our society, what it had done to the psychology of people. And we ran a campaign right across the country for 3 weeks, an intense campaign where we got on board all the media in the country, every television station, every TV station, every newspaper. And we also talked to grassroots level NGOs, because we didn't always have access to media at very grassroots levels. So we worked with grassroots level organizations to come on board, and we went out there with a very strong message, very concise, impactful campaign where we explained to people what this war had cost the country, what we have lost as a nation. And in there, we also built in a component where we asked people on the 19th of September to step outside their homes and offices at 12 noon and take a stand for peace. Hold hands if you really want a change, if you really wanted peace, if you really wanted your political leaders to come together. Well, that campaign had a tremendous impact. We had over 1 million people who stepped out onto the roads across the country. There were pockets where people didn't step out because there were people who were of strong view that this was not the way forward. But what we did was we empowered the moderate voice. We empowered the silent majority who, for first time ever, took a stand like that for peace. I think it had a tremendous impact on our political leaders. Subsequently, the government was dissolved and we had elections. And the new government came in on a mandate for peace. Our group, Sri Lanka First, we actively campaigned for voters to vote for candidates who stood for peace. We didn't care which party they were, but we believed if we had the right type of candidate in parliament, the outcome would be positive. Well, we had a very positive outcome. We had a government that came into power. Within a week of the government coming into power, the LTT declared a unilateral ceasefire, and the government reciprocated within a week. And we had the Norwegians who facilitated a ceasefire agreement. And on the 22nd of February, we had an agreement that was signed and on the table. It is now 10 months of no war. We have had 2 rounds of peace talks, and the LTT has renounced its claim for a separate state, which is a huge, huge benefit, or it is the crux of the issue. And in the process of the peace talks, it's working very well, it's very positive. We have 3 joint task forces that have emerged to deal with the economic development, security, and humanitarian issues. So I think the outcome of this is that what was a very, very difficult and bloody, violent war turned out into a very positive thing. I think the issue that happened on the 24th of July last year actually turned out to be a positive in the long term or in the short term. My task now is to continue to build support for civil society with our group Sri Lanka First, because I think importantly is to keep civil society on board. We need to keep reassuring them. We need to encourage civil society, because as long as civil society supports the peace process, our political leaders will stay in the process and we will get to a final resolution. The other aspect, as a business community, we have a responsibility to fast-track development so that we have a quick peace dividend in the hands of the people. In conclusion, I would just like to say that it takes far more courage to go for peace than it is to go for war. And I think Sri Lanka is a living example of just that. Thank you.
We are privileged and grateful to have with us 2 professors from here at the school. Phil Hyman is at the law school. He has done work in comparative criminal law, criminal justice, problems of U.S. law enforcement. Were you a deputy attorney general from 93 to 94? I thought I remembered that. And most recently, he's doing work on political violence and terrorism. Thank you very much, Phil, for coming over from the law school. Phil is joined by Jessica Stern, our own Jessica Stern, dearly beloved here at the Kennedy School, who is the author of The Ultimate Terrorists, which was published by Harvard University Press in '99, as well as numerous articles on terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. She's a lecturer here at the school. And from 94 to 95, she was the director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council. where she was responsible for national security policy toward Russia and the former Soviet states, and for policies to reduce the threat of nuclear smuggling and terrorism. Phil and Jessica, why don't you all tell us what's going on in your minds as you listen to these three women?
Okay, I got Jessica's agreement to go first.
All right.
I hear something similar in all three, Monica, Marta, and Neela, and something different. What's similar is what Neela was talking about, the determination to make peace. It really is very tempting, at least for people of my gender, to make war.
He's feeling very self-conscious.
You know, making war and fighting, particularly when you're in a fight, the other side always looks like it's being the abusive one and the one that is starting things. And the temptation to make war is very great, and it's increased by the fact that you feel like you're showing some disloyalty when you are speaking up for the point of view of the other side in a conflict situation. And if you don't say something about the other side being understandable, you can't make peace. I mean, Monica was starting there. So the thing that I see in common is this remarkable willingness, energy, courage to take the peace side on, and I mean it, on Monica, Marta, and Neela's part. Just quite remarkable to organize for peace. It sounds easy. Everybody, if you ask anybody, do you like peace or war better, they say peace. But they don't. Not when they're in a war, not when they're in a conflict. And it takes, as Neela said, it takes courage. Making peace, though, it seems to me to differ in different terrorist situations and in the three we have. What's very interesting about terrorism and making peace is that whenever you have two sides in conflict, or almost whenever, you always have a conflict within each side between the moderates and the radicals. That's certainly true in Northern Ireland, it's certainly true in Israel, it's certainly true in the Palestinian Authority, it was certainly true in Sri Lanka. Colombia may be a little bit different, but the description is there too. And if you're going to make peace, what you have to do is form an alliance between the two moderate groups. In other words, each side, the moderates on each side has to try to strengthen the moderates on the other side. And that's the alliance that makes peace. That's the Central Alliance in Northern Ireland. Terrorists have a huge advantage in being able to undermine that. By even a handful of people can destroy the trust between the moderates. Just a very small number of people. All you have to do is assassinate somebody on the other side or assassinate someone on your own side and say the other side did it. And suddenly the radicals have all the political muscle and all the enthusiasm. So terrorism is a very useful vehicle. The Middle East now is a good example of it. It's a very useful vehicle for preventing a compromise. It's hard to compromise when anyone on your side is being killed by someone on the other side, and particularly secretly. It seems I was supposed to talk particularly about Marta's description of Colombia. Colombia's in a very different situation, and what she's doing seems to me to be very, very interesting. Colombia had 4 years of the government trying to offer an olive branch to the two large guerrilla groups, and it not being accepted, and the peace offers opportunities sort of being exploited by the guerrilla terrorist groups. And at the end of that, a new government was elected, and the new government promised war. Now, at that point, it's hard to imagine how you begin to make peace. And what Marta's describing, which started before the change in government, started under the old Pastrana government, seems to me to amount to this. Very, very, very interesting. Marta emphasizes the price of illegitimacy. If the government isn't thought to be legitimate, if it isn't thought to be for everybody, if it doesn't care about human rights, if it doesn't obey the law, then what you have is a fight among gangs. Who has the biggest gang? And in Colombia, and as Monica described in Northern Ireland, and in Sri Lanka, nobody is winning that fight. It looks like it could go on forever in Colombia. It's gone on, Marta said the other day, for 40 years. It could go on forever. What could tip that would be if one gang became a respected government with legitimacy, with concern for the public. Then maybe, as Neela is describing in Sri Lanka, maybe then the benefits of peace would dictate demanding of the government that it try to make peace, but no loyalty to any other gang. Loyalty only to the gang that is rule of law, human rights, community, allied with others, their four goals. In other words, it would start looking hopeless and pointless to be a terrorist because people would regard you only as a gangster instead of just one of three gangs. That seems to me to be the strategy she's describing, and it's undoubtedly the only one with any prospect at this time. Tough time. Jessica.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here with these three truly remarkable women. It's just awe-inspiring to hear your stories. I wanted to say a little bit about Sri Lanka, which I know a little bit more about than the other conflicts. It is quite remarkable to hear what Neela has told us she and others have done. This has been a terrible, intractable conflict. Sri Lanka could have been a Singapore if not for that conflict. It's really a tragedy. And to imagine that a group of business leaders could pull off what she did on September 19th, immediately after September 11th, when I think the whole world was feeling so depressed about the problem of terrorism, getting everyone to come out of their doors holding hands, saying that they were ready for peace, it just is so exciting to hear. And listening to all three of you, I can't help but wonder, we here are very concerned about our war on terrorism. And I'm wondering what your stories can teach us about the war we are currently fighting. Some of what you've told us, I think, is a bit depressing, that both sides have to get to the point where they realize military solutions won't work. I'm afraid I think that our government is very far from that recognition. The notion that continuing to harden targets will make no difference. Neela talked about the recognition that you could spend all the money in the world on hardening the targets at that airport and it wasn't going to fix the problem. I don't know that we're there yet. Phil actually says what you need is the moderates on each side to strengthen moderation of one another. I'm trying to think about how we would go about that. And I think if we were to try to go about it, I'd love to see these three women help design the program. Monica said, and I think this is absolutely right, that the terrorist sees the counter-terrorist as a terrorist, always.
Yeah.
And what does this mean for us in our war on terrorism? Monica also says, to create peace, you need to give the enemy legitimacy. If this is what's required to get to peace, and I think it's also true that getting to peace takes a lot more courage than fighting a war, what does this mean for us in our war? And this is what I would love to hear from you.
One of you like to respond?
well, what I meant was in terms of recognizing your enemy, and that your enemy has some problems and has some causes for those problems, is about the issue of legitimacy. Because if you don't recognize the causes that the other side has and only bring the certainty of your own side, you're not truly negotiating. And if you only continue to demonize them, then you won't reach an agreement either. And it's very easy to go on blaming and demonizing and treating them as strangers or enemies. And so you have to find some point of commonality. And I think that's what I'm getting at when I'm saying I can understand from where you're sitting that the word legitimacy is a very difficult word for you to recognize. I can only say it in terms of what we had to do in Northern Ireland. And once you get this word illegitimate out of your head, and actually begin to look at people not as criminals, but as having some ideology, even though you mightn't believe it very just, there was some reason that drove them there. They just didn't end up going to prison and starving themselves to death, as they did in Northern Ireland, because they were a bunch of gangsters. They actually did believe in what they were fighting for. And although you may not agree with this, you have to get them to the table and figure out what it is that they need, not what they want. This is another issue that we have been dealing with in our peace process, and women know about this actually, that what people want is very different from what they need. And if you can start getting people to talk about what they need, then you're getting towards legitimizing where you want to go.
And President Bush asked you for
He did.
And what could we ask what you told him?
Yeah, I have a story to tell about that.
Among friends. And as you tell the story, there are 4 mics, and if somebody has a question, you should be moving to the mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last year, at March 17th, in fact, every year at St. Patrick's Day, we've been asked to come to the White House for some years now. It might be useful if the White House now said, go home and try and do it in your own place instead of coming across the Atlantic to talk. But we've traipsed across every St. Patrick's Day, and Bill Clinton threw great parties, which went on to 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning. President Bush holds his at breakfast time. So therein lies a difference. At 10 o'clock last St. Patrick's Day, I was lined up to go in. And my political party is a very small party. It's a party of women, cross-community women from both sides. So in terms of numbers, we would be the smallest political party lining up. So I was the last. And by no way was any of our political gentlemen going to say ladies first. So on this occasion, I was last, and I went in, and everyone had shaken President Bush's hand. And this was quite phenomenal, really, because there was a time when the enemies would not have gone into the room together to get their photographs taken. In fact, Paisley discovered that morning that there was going to be a photograph taken. Paisley's one of the anti-agreement leaders, and he ran away. So the rest of us went in, and I said to him, oh, here I am, a woman taking up the rump, just making a joke. And because all the others had passed on, he started talking and saying, well, how are things in Northern Ireland? And I said, well, actually, things are doing well. Time has proved to be a great healer. And he said, time? I will never allow time to allow our people to forget. And I said, you didn't hear me, Mr. President. I said, time is healing, and we're learning to forgive. I didn't say forget. And he said, forgive? He said, I'll never forgive those people in Afghanistan. He actually used slightly stronger language, I think. And I said, well, if that was the case, then you'd applied that thinking to Northern Ireland. None of us would be standing here in front of you today. If you were going to generalize about our entire country like you have just done, then we would not have had a peace process, and you would not be shaking our hands. And he had, in fact, shaken the hands that morning of what some people would have considered former terrorists. And so you can imagine I probably won't be on his invitation list for next Patrick's Day.
take our first question. Would you identify yourself? So yes. Could we have the mic on?
I'm Barbara Cospaley. I'm struck by the three of you, and congratulations, that there were two elements. One, you're working within a civil society in your own countries, and two, you're women. How do we translate that to our shores?
Okay, well, I think women have a great role to play, because women in particular have a great capacity to understand, to reconcile, and to forgive. I think we have some, not to say that men don't have it, but I think women have a particular capacity for that. And that's our strength. And that's the strength of all of us who are here today, women waging peace. But I think equally as women, we have a tremendous role to play, not just as women, but in whatever area of work that we do. And I think I can talk for my case of Sri Lanka. I think what we identified there was that there, is a very large silent majority in any community. And what happens is that in most cases, within civil society and even within political parties, the extreme voice, which is usually a very loud voice, is always picked up by the media because they are the sensationalized. They make news. So as a result, even political leaders begin to believe that the majority voice is what the extreme voice is. But in actual fact, it is not the case. Because the majority of people are silent, we don't get heard. So what we did was we actually empowered that silent majority, which is what was the change agent in the process that we had. So I think that if there is a silent majority, I think then that's a silent majority that can actually move forward, can make the difference, and you can marginalize those extreme voices if you really want to, because you are definitely the majority.
So it's a matter in a way of, it's a matter of coming in and filling the airtime in a way with a different kind of voice and being very assertive about doing that. Yes.
Hi, two questions for Monica Williams. One of them a little bit awkward.
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, sorry. I'm Sana Mandrolini from Women Waging Peace. First question. You spoke about the decommissioning of the IRA. What about the British Army? Have they dismantled their watchtowers and their units and their whatever else that they have? Question one. Question two is, given the situation now, can you tell us a little bit about what the women are doing to mobilize again in terms of getting back on track?
Okay, thank you. The first question made me think I was right back at home. That's exactly what the issue is the equivalency between demilitarization and decommissioning, which hopefully both together will drive us towards normalization. Yes, it was part of our peace agreement that the British Army would demilitarize its watchtowers and start to tear down its barracks and close the prisons. And the release of prisoners. And in fact, much of that has happened, but it's not complete, because the British government's argument on that is that there are still dissident paramilitaries, those who have not gone on ceasefire and in fact are actively working against the agreement, a bit like what Phil had said. It actually reminds me very much about domestic violence, that often after the peace agreement is signed and after a woman leaves a very violent partner, those are the most dangerous months. And in fact, the aftercare is very important. And the woman knows that actually, because 50% of women are killed after they've left a violent relationship. And quite a lot of assassinations happen after a peace agreement is signed. And so the British government are saying that they're still very reluctant to take down all of the military presence in case some of these people plant more bombs. And indeed, we've had some examples of that. On the other hand, they say that they will implement this agreement in full and that they will demilitarize completely. When, of course, they believe that all ceasefires are in practice working. Decommissioning of weapons, on the other hand, has also been an enormous difficulty. And everyone's heard this about you decommission the mindset, and then you decommission the weapons. And we had this wonderful concept, which I saw written on a church, and hence the partnerships that civic society build with churches. It had this wonderful sign saying, "Let them rust in peace." But no one would believe that they were rusting in peace if they were their enemy. So they decided that they had to have the visual handing over of weapons, and hence we set up this international commission on decommissioning, chaired by a former chairperson to the talks, and he was a general and in the United Nations and a general in the Canadian Army called General de Chastelain. And he was invited to oversee the process, and 2 acts of decommissioning have taken place. And I truly believe that they have taken place. But the unionist community, who are partners in our peace process, no longer believe that they took place because they didn't see it. And they don't believe, unfortunately, any longer in the credibility of General de Chastelain's word, which is terrible in a peace process if you invite in these very powerful, validated third-party partners and parties to your peace agreement don't believe them. So now they have actually moved on from demanding decommissioning of weapons to the disbandment of this army. And God knows what that would look like. And so you have to now, we have to, and this is answering your second question, we have to, the Women's Coalition has proposed that all the parties get back round the table and that we form an implementation committee, which in fact we got agreed in the last round of negotiations, and that we return to this table as soon as possible, and then we begin to understand and translate for each other what the other side needs. Because, you know, sometimes too in peace processes, and Mandela told us this, and many other leaders in conflict told us this, that sometimes at the most unexpected moments comes the most unexpected things, just as Neela has described. Mm-hmm. And perhaps now with our government out and my assembly now down, we need to go into those negotiations quickly. We need to work very hard at dialogue, and we need to stop this talk about people refusing to return to the table and making demands. You shouldn't make demands, you should work to achieve the outcomes, because sometimes when you demand something, you'll be guaranteed not to get it. And you actually have to build a consensus. You can't arrive at it just like that. And so these are the things that surely we have learned by now. And so we're asking, we're begging actually for our party leaders to come with us in our proposal from the Women's Coalition to get back to that table and to get back quickly. We have unfinished business. And women know all about unfinished business.
We're going to go, by the way, until 10 after, and I'm going to take a question up there.
Gautaman, MPID student here. I have 2 questions.
And we'll take your second one first.
All right. The second one is for Professor Stern. The first one was for Neela. You know, really inspired by the 3 presentations, particularly by people who are involved in the peace process for a long period, 30 years, 20 years. Now, we all know that women can play a great role. Where are the women in the Sri Lankan peace process at the higher levels? That's the question for Neela. The question for Professor Stern is, from the Sri Lankan experience, are we getting the message, if the terrorists can target and hit the business community hard enough, there can be solution?
Should reverse it.
Why don't you answer?
Yes.
No. Where are women in the peace process? We're not in the negotiating team, if that's what you mean. I think that we need to be in due course, because currently it's a progressive series of discussions. There are a lot of women who are working in the peace arena, but not directly in the actual peace talks. So I hope that answers your
Neela,
question.
do you have a sense of why they're not directly in the peace talks? I mean, when they represent half the population?
Well,
That's not uncommon, obviously,
Yes,
in peace talks, but do you have a sense of?
no, I think the reason is they are basically working on the priority areas now. They're actually, the first stage was talks about talks. Now they're talking about the sort of macro issues. But I think when it comes to further down the road, I'm pretty sure they will include women in the process. I mean, this series of talks might take years before we come to a final conclusion. But the initial round of talks, there has not been any inclusion of women.
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because deciding who you include in the talks actually decides what is going to be included in those peace negotiations, what topics are going to be included. And Monica has a great story that we probably don't have time for now about the fact that the peace talks in Northern Ireland were essentially structured with an all-male contingent until Monica came in and started a political party to get herself to those talks. And it makes a difference who you have from day one.
Well, maybe I've got work to do.
I think you do, Neela. Go back inspired. Let's get Neela to the peace table.
Oh,
right.
Not me, but there are plenty of competent women who can do that. So maybe as women, we need to take that point on board. Thank you for that. And Jessica wanted me to answer the second one. No, I don't think that's a fair question. After 20 years of war, I think, yes, that particular incident perhaps galvanized the business community. And yes, it hurt us, because it wasn't just going to hurt us, it was going to hurt all the people that were going to work, that are working for us. So it wasn't just about us, it was about everybody. So I think that we had the vision and the understanding of the consequences of that, which is what fast-tracked us into this, the process that we got into. But also, there was other factors that came into being. I mean, people were tired of the war. I mean, we had no military success on either side, so it was not a winnable war. And I think all those factors, this was the sort of climax that finally got the whole community involved.
Thanks, Neela.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Hi, my name is Barbary Cook. I'm a Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I'm also from Belfast in Northern Ireland. It's good to see you, Monica. My question follows on from the discussion that you've been having about the legitimacy of terrorists. The Kennedy School has a student newspaper called The Citizen, and this week there was an article in it saying that the only motives that terrorists have is hate. And I was wondering, in the light of the conversations at the conference for the Women Waging Peace and also tonight, what the members of the panel, and especially the American members of the panel, think the challenges are for the US as they face terrorism with an attitude like that.
So if the attitude is that the only thing motivating terrorists is hate, what does that mean if we Americans hold that attitude? And do you think, Phil and Jessica, do you think we do? Or do you think we really understand some other motivation?
I think that when you're fighting, you don't want to understand motivations. In other words, I think it's one of the prices of belligerency, that people don't want to understand the other side, except for tactical reasons. That one doesn't want to be sympathetic at that time, and that's why it becomes very dangerous to get into highly spirited belligerencies. I mean, right now, we don't understand the Muslim street, and we think that they are hateful of us, and they feel we are hateful of them. And neither side is showing much interest in understanding the other. And as long as that goes on, you have a lot of difficulty coming to a peaceful solution. If one is much more powerful than the other, you can come to a war-determined solution. But that isn't going to happen with terrorism. It's very hard to end terrorism that way.
I'll just say that I agree with Phil. I think what happens in a war situation is that both sides become less than human in a way. It's a kind of doubling situation where each side becomes a cruel, heartless creature that really, we don't want to become that creature, but it happens inevitably. I don't believe this, however. I think there's a growing debate about the root causes of terrorism. I don't think that most Americans think there is no grievance on the side of the Islamists.
If I could just add something, I think that terrorism is always a root cause. People just don't hate. And I don't think we can generalize, because there is always a reason why these things start up. And we have to go back and look at that. What is the reason? What are the root causes? Hate just doesn't happen. And also, hate begets hate. So if you fight hate with hate, it's going to take you nowhere.
And you probably know, being from Belfast, that it would take us as many years again to fight the war on hatred than it has to fight the war of the inhumanity of the weapons, the hard weapons that were used. We've now got to start inside our heads. And it will be inside our heads. I have got to be the first person to admit that I'm full of prejudice and bigotry. And when you get political leaders starting to say that, maybe we'll get some change. But yes, I mean, for me, the military war is probably over, but the sectarian war isn't. And like the racist war. And it's going to take us at least another 30 years to put all the pieces back. And I know that because my child, I have a 13-year-old son who's been attacked quite a lot recently because the school uniform is a marker, the jersey that he wears for football is a marker, and he's only 13. And I have to teach my child not to hate the kids that are doing this and not to generalize about the entire community that may be doing this to him. And that's tough and hard when you're 13 years of age. But if we don't start doing that with our next generation, then we're just building up a time bomb. And for me, the one thing that I think our government and our assembly haven't done enough work on is putting resources into our young people to get the hate out of their heads. And that starts right from the day that they are born, through their primary school years and through their high school. And there's no point in us starting to say that we can start this as adults. We have got to start now with our children and build an entirely new future for those children. And that, for me, is what drove me into politics, and that's what makes me stay there, is to get that hatred out of their heads.
I just want to add something too. We ask ourselves after 11 September, does the American people believe that somebody can hate them, and why? I mean, maybe you can make yourself these questions, and are you prepared to think about it, to discuss this? And is this place, this university, a place where we can talk about that and where we can think and reflection about these matters? Because you can see that in the third world, that people that they don't like Americans, or they don't like, it's not Americans, it's just the international policy. So maybe these questions that you are putting at the table make us think about it, and I think this is the right place to talk and to discuss about these matters.
Well, we thought we were going to gather tonight to listen to three women talk about places far away. Northern Ireland, we have our stereotypes about Colombia, all you drug traffickers, and the Sri Lankans. And we thought you were going to tell us about the techniques you'd use to work with people who are political prisoners and work across the party lines and create coalitions and bring civil society in a big way, to use your resources to launch a campaign to actually change the mind of a whole nation. And instead, you've certainly talked about those things, but you've brought this question right here into our front yards. And more than that, you've actually brought it inside of us in a way that I didn't anticipate. So we're going to be leaving this evening not just talking about states and treaties and coalitions and alliances. We're going to be leaving thinking about ourselves and what we do to help hate live on from generation to generation, or what we do to create transcendence was your word, wasn't it? How we create transcendence in our society, in our community, at this school, in our families, and perhaps most important, in that deep inner space. Thank you all for being here.
Good summary. A beautiful summary.
Thanks very much.
Precisely. I'm Native American and African American. This is from Israel. That's from Jerusalem. Right, my Jerusalem cross.